Hello everyone, my name is Haonan. The first part of the case compares two political systems, which as formal institutions influences the political environment of a country's economic development. The case starts with the quote, "Democracy is good and dictatorship is bad," and then continues to explain that during the second half of the 20th century, the wave of becoming a democracy is unstoppable, even with the most difficult terrains such as Germany, Japan, South Africa, and India. Recently, democracy has also expanded to more countries such as Algeria, Egypt, and Libya. It is no wonder that we ask, why does democracy have such broad appeals as a political system around the world? In order to answer the question, we have to understand how political system influences the economic development. With every country and every market, there are certain rules to be followed by every firms. The textbook argues that in order for a firm to be successful in doing business, they need to understand and take advantages of these rules. This means firms need to constantly monitor, decode, and adapt to the changing rules of the environment for them to survive and prosper. This perspective leads to the main topic of Chapter 2, the institution-based view. The institution-based view provides two propositions, and the first proposition states that managers and firms rationally pursue their interest and make choices within institutional constraints. So what are the institutional constraints? The rules that every player within a certain area has to follow. The institutional framework is how firm behaviors are governed, and under that framework, we have formal institutions, which refers to the law, regulations, and the rules. Within formal institutions, we have different political systems, and Chapter 2 discusses about two different political systems, which are democracy and totalitarianism. Democracy is a political system in which citizens elect representatives to govern the country. It grants individuals the right to freedom of expression and organization. On the other hand, the totalitarianism stands on an opposite position, which one person or party has absolute political control over the population. There are different types of totalitarianism as well. They can be categorized into four main types: the communist totalitarianism, the right-wing totalitarianism, the theocratic totalitarianism, and the tribal totalitarianism, and I will briefly explain them one by one. The communist totalitarianism refers to a political environment that centers on Communist Party. The right-wing totalitarianism is, on the other hand, against communism. It argues that freedom would eventually lead to communism, so that political freedom should not be granted to public. The theocratic totalitarianism refers to the monopolization of a political power in hands of one religious group, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran. The tribal totalitarianism refers to one tribe or ethnic group that has the absolute political power over other tribes or ethnic groups. Well, I haven't answered the question yet. Why does democracy have such a broad appeal? As you can see from my prior explanation, the democratic society experiences less wars, riots, protests, chaos, and breakdowns, thus provides a more stable business environment with less risks. The number one thing all businesses are trying to avoid is big risk. Thus, democracy has a better business environment for local firms to grow due to less political risk. Totalitarianism often produces higher political risk, and one of the most extreme risks for any foreign assets, is the expropriation of foreign investment. For example, the nationalization of foreign assets. And to sum up, democracy has such a broad appeal because first, it grants individuals rights to the freedom of expression so that the society is more stable and with less risks for any business owners to succeed. Second, democracy is more likely to attract foreign investment because foreign assets are less likely to be nationalized comparing with totalitarianism. Now my friend Raagu will discuss about the second case question. How does democracy suffer from severe setbacks in some countries lately?
Hello, my name is Raagu, and I'm going to talk about how does democracy suffer from severe setbacks in some countries. To best answer this question, I'm going to talk about new democracies like Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Thailand, and Ukraine, about old democracies like United States, India, and European Union, and lastly, I'm also going to talk about economic growth between democratic countries and authoritarian government. So, when I talk about democratic setbacks in new democracies like Egypt, Iraq, in all these new democracies, it is easier to get rid of the old regime than to establish a fully functioning democratic government, due to which economy suffers, jobs disappear, and quality of living conditions decline too, which caused civil unrest in Iraq and Libya, and even caused military coups which smashed democracies in Egypt and Thailand. When we talk about Ukraine, foreign intervention from Russia brought the vulnerable Ukraine's democracy to its limits. All these serves as an example of democratic setbacks in the new democracies. Now let's talk about established old democracies like United States, European Union, and India. To give you some examples, in 2013, partisan politicians shut down the federal government of the United States of America for 17 days, which is a clear example of dysfunctional democracy. The US government even threatened to default on its debt twice in 2011 and in 2013. And another example would be the introduction of euro by the European Union in 1999. It was basically dictated to the general public. As the only two European Union countries where democratic referendum was conducted to decide whether to adopt the euro or not, the public in both the countries said no. But euro was still adopted and it led to higher taxes all across the European Union. Even when we talk about economic growth, the growth rate of a democratic government like India is only half of China's totalitarian government. Another example would be Russia. Russia grew faster under Putin's authoritarian rule during the 2000s as compared to when Russia was more democratic before the 2000s. Another example would be Hong Kong. Hong Kong, with little democracy, has a higher per capita income than Britain, which is the world's oldest democracy. And the last example would be the Great Recession of 2000, which brought many countries to its knees. It serves as a major example in one of the setbacks in democracy. Now, after hearing about so many setbacks of democracies, which do you think is better? A democratic government or a totalitarian government? I know you can't answer, but just give it a thought. And now my teammate will talk about the totalitarian government and take up the presentation from there. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is Xiaocheng Chi. The third question is how does the Chinese experience answer the question, is democracy good for economy development? To further discuss the question, we need to know what is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism capitalism is defined as a political system in which one person or party exercises absolute political control over the population. There are four major types of totalitarianism. First one is communist totalitarianism, which centers on a communist party. Second is right-wing totalitarianism. It's characterized by its intense hatred against communism. The third one is theocratic totalitarianism, referred to the monopolization of political power in the hand of one religion party or group. The first one is tribal totalitarianism, referred to one tribe or ethnic group which may or may not be the majority of the population, monopolizing political power and opposing other tribe or ethnic group. The next thing we need to know is the economy system. The economy system refers to the rule of the game on how a country is governed economically. There are three different types. First one is the market economy. All business activities should follow the invisible hand of the market. The second one is command economy, which the government controls all business activities. Third one is a mixed economy, which has elements of both the market economy and the command economy. Based on this particular case study, China shows that democracy is not necessary for a nation's economic growth. As we can see from the case, the 2013 Pew Survey of Global Attitude found that 85% of Chinese were very satisfied with their country's direction, compared with only 31% of Americans and 30% of British, and 20% of Japanese. Most importantly, let's see here. In 2 years, China implemented patient coverage to an additional 240 million rural residents, a process that would take decades in democracy. According to the case, we can feel that democracy is not a vital component for economic growth in China. However, I have a different view. Based on my experience and study, China's economic growth, along with China's democratization process. We all know China is a communist totalitarianism country, in which one communist party, the CCP, runs the country. As a communist country, China used to learn from the Soviet Union, which chose the command economy as the economic system during Mao's period. Along with the development of China's economy, lots of problems were starting to appear. One of the most famous one is called the Great Leap Forward. The leading party CCP made one bad decision and caused a great economic recession of the whole nation in 1950s to 1960. After Mao's demise, China finally had the opportunity to move on to another growth, especially during the time when the CCP was running by Deng Xiaoping. He was a pioneer that advocated the Chinese economy reform in 1978. When he started the Chinese economic reform, lots of foreign investment flow into China. For example, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Panasonic entered the Chinese market in 1980s, and in return they all had rapid growth. Meanwhile, the Chinese government started shifting from a command economy towards a mixed economy. Then private ownership was finally allowed in China, which is a milestone of privatization in China, with a further development of the economy. More and more people began to care about the violation of their private property. The private property law of the past can no longer adapt to the development of modern society. The new property law of the People's Republic of China, adopted at the fifth session of the 10th National People's Congress on March 16, 2007, and effected on October 1, 2007. China's achievements in economic development in the past 2 decades are inseparable from China's reform and opening up, and I think reform and opening up is an attempt by China to democratize. As you can see on this figure, China started to grow rapidly after the Chinese economic reform, which is after 1979. Thank you. Next question will answered by my teammate.
Hello, my name is Jake Boyle, and I'm dealing with the fourth question of this week's case. We've been presented with an ethical dilemma where the military governments of Egypt and Thailand have invited our firm to do business in their countries. We appreciate the lucrative offers in Egypt and Thailand, but we are concerned about the public opinion around our move to these military economies. How are we to proceed? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is when we go uproad to these military economies, what determines the success or failure of our firm? And if success of the firm is feasible in these military economies, how do we maintain positive ethical practices in these military economies? So I'd first like to explore who the stakeholders are involved in this move to Egypt and Thailand. First, it would be the military governments of the new markets. They're both failed democracies. In the past decade or so, each country attempted to form a democracy, but they were overthrown by the military governments and now perform in a totalitarian state. This means that many of the competitors that we may see in Egypt and Thailand would be state-owned enterprises, so that's definitely worth considering and something that we should take into account. The second stakeholder I'd like to talk about is us. What is our reputation if we make this move? There's a considerable amount of potential growth since these military economies are quite lucrative. But what is it going to do to our reputation? And how do we maintain ethical practices if we do make this move? The third stakeholder I'd like to speak about are our shareholders if we are a corporation. What would their opinion be? Would we have the support of them? And what would happen to our stock value if we were to make the choice to move into Egypt and or Thailand? And finally, the local populations of Egypt and Thailand. In the aftermath of the failing of their democracies, the local population is really what suffered. Jobs were lost, economies floundered. So, is it possible for us to move into these military economies and make some positive changes for the locals? I certainly think that it would be possible to create systems where we as a firm can create positive change for the locals. But first, it's important to determine if the firm can be successful in these new markets. The markets carry existing institutions, both formal and informal, and those will play a big part in the potential success of the firm. So I'd like to go through the stakeholders that we've outlined and show how they relate to the institutions and the potential success of the firm. So first is the existing governments in Egypt and Thailand. Their political institution is military totalitarianism. So there's a significant amount of political risk for us as a firm. Totalitarian societies tend to have more wars, riots, protests, general chaos, and breakdowns. And in the past, there's been evidence of expropriation of foreign assets. For example, Argentina expropriated YPF, and Zimbabwe took majority ownership of the foreign mining companies that were operating in their country. Another institution that is notable from the government's side of this move would be the economic institutions in both Egypt and in Thailand. For both of them, it is a mixed economy, but is leaning more towards a command economy, naturally because their governments are totalitarian. What does this mean for us? Do we still proceed knowing that the economy is generally commanded by the government? Moving on, the success of the firm as it relates to the legal institutions in these countries. Are there formal rules in Egypt and Thailand that would protect our company, or is the government's say exactly what becomes law? This is important to our firm because of intellectual property rights and property rights. IPR has a ton of value and is also, therefore, a big concern for our shareholders. Will the shareholders' investments be protected by the patents, copyrights, trademarks, etc., or do these not exist in these totalitarian states? Are we at higher risk of piracy in a totalitarian-run market because a lot of the citizens of these countries make their big money in the gray and black markets rather than at state-owned enterprises? And speaking of the citizens of these countries, what does our firm face with the locals? What can we offer to the locals? They bring a lot of informal institutions to the picture. Their cultures, ethics, and norms. Will they buy from us? Will they work for us? Can we make a positive change for them? So this will all have to be determined to see if we can be successful in these new markets in the first place. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that we have been able to determine that, yes, going up road in Egypt and Thailand is feasible. We went through all of the stakeholders, we looked at how the institutions balance with them and affect our feasibility as a firm when moving into these new economies. What do we do now? How do we proceed now that we've decided that we are going to indeed launch in Egypt and Thailand? Well, first, we need to make sure that we're respecting the informal institutions that exist in both Egypt and Thailand. So we have to make sure that we're matching the cultures, ethics, and norms of the locals, whether that be in our marketing, in the way that we sell our product or service to them, or if we're hoping to hire the locals as employees for our firm, we need to align with their cultures, ethics, and norms in our work practices. We also need to adjust to the formal institutions that exist in these countries. making sure that we fit in with the way that the mixed economy works, making sure that we take the necessary steps to mitigate our political risk, and ensuring, as we move into this point, that the legal systems that exist support us. So making sure that our IPR, or if we have physical, tangible value, that our property rights are protected. And finally, as we launch into these new markets, we hope to make positive changes for the locals. So when the locals lost their democratic governments to these military totalitarian governments, they lost a lot of their freedoms, they lost a lot of money, they lost a lot of potential economic growth. So what can we do for the locals to create positive change in their lives? Very good benefits for our employees. Try to create as many jobs as possible for the locals in these economies. So yes, there is definitely a way to launch ethically in totalitarian states, and I would suggest that we proceed into Egypt and Thailand.